On October 24th, 2020, Missouri's Joint Committee on Education, a committee of state senators and representatives, held a committee hearing next door to my office to discuss COVID-19. I thought it was highly unusual since committee hearings were typically conducted at the Capitol building in Jefferson City. But in this case, with my community's proximity to the Capitol and with access to multiple media outlets, the more than 5-hour hearing was held a little over a mile from my own home. On her website describing the hearing, the senator, a self-described champion for charter schools, said, "It is important for state leaders, school officials, parents, and students to come together and have their voice heard on this important issue in what could only be described as a public execution of public education. I was instructed to sit in the front row while pre-selected parents and children gave public testimony on the difficulties they were having with virtual instruction. After each testimonial, participants were asked whether they would accept a voucher if it were made available to them, and many responded that they would. And at some point in the hearing, my board president and another Board of Education member and I were invited to make a statement and answer questions. And when one of the senators, in defiance of the local health department's mask mandate, said that he had a question for me, I quickly jumped in and said, "Senator, if it's to ask me if I would accept a voucher, I would not." I do regret succumbing to impulsivity and making the joke, but the senator did laugh, as many did in the room. But the ridiculous of it all was so incredibly frustrating. My guest today speaks to this phenomenon for superintendents, that the job has gotten even more political. His article, Caught in the Crosshairs, he writes how, as the narrative arc of division rises, superintendents can play the critical role of influencer to bend the arc towards inclusion, compassion, and peace. He absolutely inspired me on this. Dr. Allan Mucerino is my guest. It's a great episode. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Dr. Allan Mucerino is my guest. Dr. Mucerino is the superintendent of the Olive Unified School District, a pre-K through 12 school district with about 17,500 students, 2,500 employees in the western portion of the city of Riverside, the eastern portion of the city of Corona, and segments of the unincorporated communities of Riverside County. So lots of community perspectives. Dr. Mucerino has served as a high school and middle school principal, an assistant superintendent, and a superintendent for the past 29 years. When you think about the national average, that is incredible. Allan considers himself a research practitioner. He's been a member of the California State University Fullerton Department of Education faculty for the past 14 years as a superintendent in residence. He's been teaching doctoral level courses, supervising dissertations in practice, and serving on the executive committee for doctoral studies. Dr. Allan Mucerino, or as your students may call you, Dr. Moose, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Well, Peter, it's a privilege to be here with you. I love your work, and I'm absolutely honored to be your guest today. So thank you.
Well, I'm now, upset that this is not a video podcast because I'm blushing. Allan, I feel truly, it goes both ways. I feel incredibly lucky to talk with you. And when this episode airs, your forthcoming article, Caught in the Crosshairs, will have been published. And I had the honor of reading an advance copy, so I know it's not in its final form yet. But the essence of the article is intact. And toward the end of the article, you bring forward the idea that schools are essentially a mirror of what's happening in society, and that maybe they didn't start that way, but certainly since Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka in 1954, that schools have been thrust into the national dialogue on some pretty weighty issues. And now, superintendents who previously, and this is in your words, saw themselves as agnostic when it came to politics, are now really being forced into politics. So the title is perfect, Caught in the Crosshairs. So many of us felt that way during the pandemic, for sure. So I wonder, would you talk a little bit about what motivated you to write this article, and really what types of conversations you hope it will initiate or instigate?
Yeah, I was motivated by the fact that schools have become contested places. Carl Cohn talks about how schools have become places that no longer are about working together. It seems to be about sides, choosing sides, and then digging your heels in. We have experienced quite a bit of that here in my community, Riverside County, with some of our local districts and the superintendents who have been caught in the crossfires and the crosshairs of it all have not had good outcomes.
I think that's really interesting. As a superintendent in the Midwest in a university town that was 300 square miles, that was really split ideologically on many issues, and certainly sort of came to light where I certainly felt myself more in the crosshairs during the pandemic. We had a police car outside our house for 4 months because of the kind of threats we were getting and those types of things. So when I read your article, it really spoke to me. In the leadership model I use to advise others, there's a dimension. It's called nested patterns. And that really is the muscle of an organization's work. It kind of speaks to answer the all-important question, how will we be together? And inside that dimension are these terms, empathy and compassion. Now, the article we just talked about isn't how I first learned about you. Actually, you wrote another piece, The Moral Imperative of Empathy Leadership. And it was in this piece that I said to myself, I have to meet this leader. He's speaking about empathy in such a deep and meaningful way. Would you read what you wrote?
I will. Thank you. Empathic leaders create safe and productive environments built on a shared vision for success and a strong sense of belonging. As Sebastian Junger wrote in his book, Tribe, people have a strong instinct to belong. How do leaders build a strong sense of belonging among their students and staff or in their organization? They begin by deciphering competing voices and giving all voices the space to be heard without filtering those voices through a personal lens.
I just love that. So I want to ask you about this, particularly about empathy. And there's another piece in this model called harvesting the collective wisdom. And it really is this sort of, how do you in your organization attend to the different perspectives, as well as recognize really what it is that people are saying or believing, right? So how do you filter out the loudest voice and things like that? So how do you avoid filtering out perspectives?
First and foremost, you have to understand empathy. Empathy has various components related to trying to understand where people are coming from. It's the cognitive empathy that has to be developed. And you develop cognitive empathy by understanding people's stories, which is why empathy interviews are amongst the best types of data collection. And whenever you go in and work with organizations, be it my own or others, it always starts with empathy interviews to truly understand where people are coming from. We have our own biases. We all are born with them, and whatever privilege we've been afforded will shape the way we see things. And that's that personal lens I wrote of. But as you get better at cognitive empathy and you really put yourself in the shoes of the person that you're listening to, and that takes empathic listening. It's just something that you have to practice. But if you do that, then it's easier to understand why someone is seeing things the way they're seeing things. Now, you may not be able to decenter them, but what you'd like to do at least is to listen to them so that they will listen to you.
So I imagine, we've all been socialized in a certain way, and it absolutely impacts the way that we behave. And that really what you're advocating for is this ability to try to find where you can seek some common ground. That doesn't mean to betray your beliefs and your values, but to rather lean in the way that Margaret Wheatley will talk about, being willing to dispute what you believe to be indisputable. I'm curious, what does an empathy interview look like? How does it start?
Empathy interviews take on a variety of different looks. If you're interviewing children, for example, you're trying to learn how they feel as whoever they are, whatever profile it is that they identify with. What is the school's culture doing to or for them? Do they feel like they belong? This concept of place leadership, which for me was something that was born out of teaching in the Vietnam diaspora in the 80s. And I've mentioned this to you in past conversations, this idea of someone belonging to a place. And during the era of which we were busing students and sending them here or there, all of which was proven not to be terribly successful and has pretty much reverted back to how it was all about we not identifying with a place, not having a sense of belonging. So when you're working as Catherine Riley has written extensively about with people of diasporas, it's all about helping them feel like they belong. They belong, even though they don't look like anyone else looks, even though they don't act like anyone else acts, they belong. And until they have a sense of belonging, they will not be successful, or at least a large percentage of them will not be successful.
You can read Guadalupe Valdez's work about children, Latina children, Latinx kids along the border in Texas and certainly in Southern California and Arizona. And she writes about exactly why kids learn or don't learn English, but then there's this sort of deeper piece about belonging. And then generations of not belonging because we have sort of forced a particular system that has been, rooted in its own history of being predominantly white that has absolutely impacted a child's ability to learn. So I imagine when working with the Vietnamese diaspora and coming to the United States in the 1980s as refugees and building communities, that those who were most successful were living in communities where the community embraced and worked to cultivate a cultural field that was more inclusive.
Yeah, without a doubt. My grandparents came to America about the same time your granddad, Jacob, I believe it was, came to America. Mine came from Italy, however.
Mucerino, who would have guessed?
Who would have guessed? But they came at a time when you assimilated, and that was the expectation. Unfortunately, I don't speak Italian because my parents would not allow any of us to speak Italian because that's when they were talking about us. So they didn't want us to know that language. They wanted us to speak English only. I never got a chance to speak to my grandparents because they never spoke English. But my point is that was a time where you fit in, like your granddad changed his name, anything to fit in because you wanted to belong. And it's no different today. Kids want to belong today too, no matter what it is they look like or act or behave. And we have that lesson that's right in front of us, our own history, yet somehow it's set aside. For what reason, Peter? I don't know.
How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Well, gosh, and you and I have had some conversations, some exchanges about this, and be it in each other's writings or in some brief conversations we have. But I have a history, a leadership history that's really could be a poster child for today's up and coming leaders and aspirants. Because I was thrust into positions long before I was prepared. And if I may use the fruit metaphor, how often do people use the fruit metaphor on your pods, Peter? But fruit's not. If you don't eat, if the fruit isn't ripe, you're not going to get all the nutritional balance that it offers, or you're also going to get those physical compounds that haven't matured out of it yet. I mean, it's downright dangerous. It introduces toxins to your systems. Well, it's the same thing with leaders. And my first principalship, I was a AP, my first assistant principal job for 2 weeks. And the principal got ill and left, and the superintendent came in. He said, school starts in a week. I know you don't know what the hell you're doing, but you're in charge. So figure it out. So I sat down with my team. And again, I was new to the school. It was my first job. I didn't even know, I hardly knew anyone. But I had a wonderful woman, a teacher there at the school union, rep for the school, who took me aside, and named Sandy Asper, wonderful, wonderful person, who said, "Allan, don't worry, we could do this. Just follow our lead." So I tell this story in many keynotes because I say I was raised by teachers. People assume that's my mom and dad. No, my dad was a truck driver. My mom was a telephone operator. I'm a first gen college student. So no, I was raised by teachers when I first became a principal. So my imperfections were there for everyone to see. And I relied on them. They got me through. 6 months later, when the superintendent came back and said, we were going to post a position and do all that, and you're going to go through the process. But you know what? I think if I appointed anyone else to this job, the union will hang me. So congratulations, you're the next principal. And I was a principal for the next 17 years. Then when I became an assistant superintendent, my superintendent was let go after a year and a half of me being there with him, and I became acting superintendent again, thrust into the position well before I was ripe, so to speak. So I had to rely on others. I had to rely on people who knew what they were doing, which is why of all the different strategies and things that I bring to my districts and to my professional life, I value nothing more than being a mentor, than being a friend, being someone who shows my vulnerabilities as a way to show you could be successful, you could reach the top of your profession by being vulnerable. You don't have to be perfect, right? All perfection does, or this need for perfection, is bring on shame. You're who you are. And we're all imperfect. And to believe we're anything other than that, it's an illusion.
And we'll be right back. In the many conversations I've been having with leaders all across the country, there are some themes that keep popping up. And one is the fact that children are really having a hard time engaging in school. And one big part of that is the phone that's in their hands. Schools around the world are seeing the damaging effects of phones on student engagement, social development, mental health. Yonder is a company that has developed a unique product and program to allow schools to become phone-free, from arrival to dismissal. Learn why 1 million students use Yonder every day. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. Go to overyonder.com to learn more. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader, called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. And my guest is Dr. Mucerino, who goes by Moose or Dr. Moose, and he's the superintendent of the Alvord Unified School District in Southern California. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision they had to make, and then we discuss it. Now, typically, Moose, I ask my guests before we even start the interview, tell me, what are you thinking about in terms of your after action review? I didn't do that to you today. So this is going to be a complete surprise. What happened?
Well, there's a lot of examples of things that didn't go as planned. I believe being imperfect is all about that. I'm going to choose among many, many choices an experience I had where someone was appointed to a position that they were not ready to do. I think that's topical right now because a lot of superintendents, at least in California, because we've had a superintendent exodus here, have been put into positions before they're ready. As I shared a little bit earlier in the pod, I was talking about myself being someone who could be the poster child for that, because I was thrust into positions for no reason other than I happened to be there. And it's simple as that. And I'm not ashamed to say that. But I've always argued that it is urgency, not good, that is the enemy of great. Because if there's any example, it would be No Child Left Behind and other policies that were well intended. But because there were serious consequences if you didn't turn around schools in a short period of time, people resorted to all kinds of things. And I argue that you have to find that that in between, because clearly kids can't wait for us to get our act together either. So it's not like we could take forever, but if we let urgency drive decision making, then we're really not going to be able to have that sustainable long-term success that we hope for. So I was in a district as a superintendent that had a long history of declining enrollment, such that when I was hired, they told me that we want transformational change. And I recognized that there was a risk there because transformational change in lots of cases lead to very short shelf life for superintendents. Once you start talking about closing schools and reconfiguring schools and restructuring districts, people get extremely anxious. No one likes their cheese moved, Peter. We know that. We all learned that lesson, probably in kindergarten, but nonetheless, we live by it. But that was my charge. So I came in and started the work immediately, thinking that it was going to be the Band-Aid approach that's going to be best to do this. Let's get it over with. Let's be clear. This is the charge. This is the consequence of not fulfilling this obligation. We will basically have very few students left because this was in the era when consumer-driven education was really driving a lot in California. Charter schools were thriving. There was a big interest in choosing schools as though you're choosing a cantaloupe. And that became an incredible challenge for school districts that were on the other end of that, who were losing kids to districts that appeared to be more successful. So I went ahead and I just ripped the Band-Aid off. We did the work, and I'm happy to say the work has sustained and continues on, and is good work. It also led to me moving on to my current position, where I'm in my 6th year. But I would not have done that in retrospect.
So let's walk through that a bit. So if I understand correctly, first of all, you sort of set the context in terms of particularly where we are right now in terms of superintendents in their first 3 years. I talked with a state leader recently, 60% in his state. In the state of Washington, I've been told 60% as well. And so you've got a lot of new leaders who are being thrust into some really big, important decisions. And so that you put that side by side with you yourself were an early leader and having to make some pretty big decisions. There is a archetype in systems thinking. One of them is fixes that backfire, right? That quick fix that we think will just sort of, I'm going to pull the Band-Aid off, or I'm going to treat this symptom and it probably is going to be okay. And then the unintended consequences begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then you have to deal with that before you can get to that underlying issue. And so in the scenario that you've shared with us in terms of having to close a school or have a conversation with a community about doing something big like that, there had to be some pieces that got overlooked. How wonderful that in the end, there are some good things to sort of discuss and to share. But initially, as you're looking back now, there are some things that got overlooked. And I wonder what got overlooked.
The need to take a longer period of time to try to understand everyone's perspective, knowing that it's going to be controversial for those who are affected by it. In other words, the actual community itself that school would be closed, for example, or the teachers that would be moved from this school to that school, for example. Because the urgency was driving the decision-making, we did rip the Band-Aid off, knowing that it was going to be controversial either way. But I believe I overlooked, and I take full responsibility for it, the need and desire to convince my then Board of Education to take a little longer. Let's try to help everyone understand it a little better.
Right, because then you're not mending fences perpetually, or at least for a few years, because you're trying to rebuild trust, right? You can spend so much time building trust, and then it can just evaporate fairly quickly. And I think similarly, whether it's closing a school or pursuing a tax increase or a bond for a building, that if you do it quickly, sometimes what you'll find is that the community feels as if you're rushing them and that they don't fully understand. And that really damages the district's reputation. So I imagine you've learned a lot about relationships in this scenario, and then certainly moving forward. At that time, or looking back, what did you learn about relationships, or what new relationships were formed?
Well, I certainly learned that no relationship should be left behind. If it continue to bring everyone along, and even those who are detractors and those that I wish I had taken more time to build trust with. I went in as an experienced education leader and did feel as though I had developed that trust, and the board certainly trusted me with this work. And they, of course, represented their community who trusted them. So I felt by extension that there was trust, but in retrospect, it needed to be even stronger. Those relationships needed to be stronger to withstand what became transformational work that did affect people disproportionately. I'm happy to say all's well that ends well, but I don't like the idea that you have to bring certain people along with you, screaming, fighting, and dragging. That's certainly my regret. I believe another year before that actual configuration occurred would have really helped to have developed the trust necessary for people to say, okay, I'm with you.
What frustrated you in that situation?
And I referenced this earlier, but I'm not sure if that's going to appear on the pod, but I talked about kids can't wait for us to get our act together. We had a district that was losing students because they were choosing to go to other schools. This was a 15-year trend. And when we did empathy interviews with students, they were very clear. They felt as though there were low expectations, that they couldn't be that successful. They were children from a impoverished community, and that there just wasn't a high expectation. So I felt like that, you know what, I need to do something. I mean, I'm putting my cape on here. And so I was frustrated by the fact that we couldn't get everyone on board. What's taken so long? Well, trust. You got to let that happen naturally. It has to be organic. And so I was kind of in between knowing what was best, because again, this argument about urgency being the enemy of great. And then on the other side of that, kids not having to suffer because the adults don't have their acts together.
But I'm curious about that as this sort of what you could have done differently. So clearly that was a frustration for you, this, sort of this drum of, this is the only time the child's going to be in third grade. I mean, I even mentioned that in my own book, this sort of, we have to make these decisions now. And you get caught up in that moment. Right. And so that's really frustrating. And so then looking at that, it's sort of to say, okay, I understand what got overlooked and what could have been or should have been, but we play a role in that as leaders. And so I'm going to push a little bit and say, what could you have done differently?
I could have paused, reflected on where we have come at certain points, and determine whether we should stay on this course or slow down and stretch it out, knowing that the students that are currently being left behind may suffer, but there may be other ways we could still address their needs so that the long-term implications will still have the same effect, but that there aren't any students left behind in the interim. So I really believe that I needed to stop and reflect more often. I was driven by the desire to bring about what my Board of Education tasked me to do.
Of course, we want to do a good job for our bosses.
I wanted
right?
to be perfect.
Yes. See, it was just well in advance of this important podcast. In the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience? Because I halted you at the beginning because I said, "Oh, I don't want to know yet."
Boy, so many things. First and foremost, that district, that program, the transformation continues to thrive. The current superintendent is a partner of mine in what's known as superintendents.net, which is a group that supports superintendents. And he continues to do quality work in that very same district. So that's certainly the best that came out of it. The relationship I have with so many of my colleagues there that remain today. I'm close with everyone, as well as city officials who were very involved in it, because the district served a city of 22,000, and that was the centerpiece of the city. So people appreciated the work and knew it was difficult work, knew it was transformational work, knew it was the kind of work that leads to a short shelf life. So I was willing to take that risk, and they appreciated that. So many good things came out of it, Peter.
What advice would you have to an aspiring or new or even an established leader?
I do a lot of this work. I work with a lot of potential leaders, particularly in my role at the university, all students working on their doctorate with the hopes and aspirations to lead schools and or districts. It's being vulnerable. It is being the type of leader that makes people want to follow. It's simple. It's being yourself. I love the idea and the concept, and I've written a lot about this. You are who you are. Whatever adjective leader you happen to be depends on the situation. Typically, you're who you are as a person. If you're a good-hearted, compassionate, empathetic person, you're going to lead that way, and that's going to be clear. So you have to be yourself. Again, so many psychologists and other authors who talk about leadership in the context of psychology and understanding and being quality people talk about how important it is for you to be yourself, for you to be authentic. And authenticity requires courage, a lot of courage, because your authentic self, you're not going to be able to hide behind that. I mean, I've written 150 or so pieces. It's all out there. Everybody could see who I am and what I'm all about. So I can't be anything other than what I have written about myself and what I do and what I believe in. But that's a tough thing for leaders. I got the advice when I first started down this path that superintendency is a great last job. And it's a great last job because you don't want to be beholden to anyone but the kids. And if you're beholden to those with political ambitions or constituents for the wrong reasons, and that's what many soups are finding themselves in right now, then you're not going to be able to do what's right. When it's your last job, you could do what's right and stand by it. And that was excellent advice. Now, I am now in my second last job.
My guest again was Dr. Mucerino, the superintendent of the Alvord Unified School District in Southern California. And Allan, or Moose, now I would like to count myself among your friends, Moose. I really have been talking to a number of people around the country about the idea of leader longevity, the fact that so many superintendents across the nation are in their first 3 years. And so everything you talked about today, whether it's about sort of thinking about how superintendents are caught in the crosshairs, thinking about ways to emphasize empathy, to embrace the community that either you are leading or that you are now a part of and letting them help you lead. The fact that urgency can be the enemy of great, and that really being courageous and willing to stand up for maybe slowing some things down. Often they can come out great decisions in the end. However, knowing that you can really build that community with your people if you can take just a little bit more time to build those enduring relationships. I've learned so much from you today. I'm really grateful for the time that you've given me.
Well, thank you, Peter, and I have as well.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.